Adaptation is something that generally comes slower than quicker, and that's not really what you want. But with so much going on a match, it can be really tough to pluck out useful information. When a match is going by at blitzkrieg speed, a lot of wires can get crossed if your thought process isn't organized, which makes adapting pretty difficult. Every opponent is a big, complicated mess you need to sort out as quickly as possible, and the best way to deal with complicated problems is simply to break them down into smaller, more doable parts. So, let's not waste any time and talk about exactly how to build your own framework for breaking complicated opponents down into sets of much easier to understand parts. Every character can take advantage of different behaviors in different ways, and has tools that can elicit different behaviors. Similarly, every character has different weaknesses or shortcomings that can be attacked. As such, different characters need to look for different things and classify opponents with respect to these strengths and weaknesses. Some behaviors are more useful to make note of than others, in other words. This is the first consideration in effectively classifying opponents. Knowing behaviors that are relevant to your character's strengths and weaknesses, and choosing which of those behaviors to look out for. That said, the behaviors you can know about someone fall into two categories: innate and variable. Innate behaviors are what a character by design just does, like jump heights, while variable behaviors are obviously variable and vary from player to player. The first step is to classify innate behaviors so we can have a better idea of what to look out for once the match actually begins. So let's look at a few examples of innate behaviors. Two very basic classifications of innate behaviors might be characters that have, say, multi-hit aerials, and those that have single-hit aerials. This knowledge is important because simply communicating this fact to yourself may help you to not drop shield prematurely. This same information can be framed in terms of parrying as well. Parrying can be pretty important, but whether I bother parrying should depend largely on what the nature of my opponent's out-of-shield options is. Trying to parry against Pichu would be pointless because his out-of-shield options are mostly multi-hit. Trying to parry against Toon Link, however, is probably a better bet since most of his out-of-shield options are single-hit. So, I can classify characters as either parry or non-parry, and this is useful information. Another potential innate classification is what I call symmetry, in this case with respect to front and rear aerial options out of shield. As Ganon, how I act after I land an aerial on my opponent's shield should account for which side I've hit them on. For example, DK is asymmetric because his rear out of shield options are generally better than his front. Pichu, on the other hand, is symmetric because his out-of-shield options are generally good irrespective of which side I hit his shield. Now, if we're satisfied with our relevant innate behaviors going in, we move on to variable behaviors. To make variable classifications useful, we first need to establish frames of reference, that is, events and exact moments in time at which we can gather useful information about who we're playing. This is for two reasons. The first is so that our classifications aren't too vague, which is definitely something to be cautious of because classifying someone as simply aggressive alone doesn't really tell us what to look out for, and equally importantly, when to look out for it. Secondly, it's hard to pull information from a quickly flowing match if everything just sort of blends together, so we need to assign significance to certain events. As I mentioned earlier, different characters need to look out for certain things more than others, so let's look at what frames of reference a Ganon might establish to classify their opponent. A few things I personally would like to know about my opponent are the following. How do they try to get out from being pinned at the ledge? How do they get off of platforms? How do they behave when I hit their shield? So naturally, the three frames of reference here are when I have them pinned at the ledge, when they're on a platform, and when I connect an aerial on their shield. Once one of these happens, I make a mental note of what my opponent does. When I have them cornered at the ledge, do they jump, roll inward, or reset to ledge? On a platform, do they run off the back, jump away, or hold shield? When I hit their shield, do they add a shield aerial, roll, or shield grab? Now, I should be really careful to make one thing very clear. There are no right classes or categories to think in terms of. These were just examples for me personally, frames of reference I've established for what I think is important for Ganon. This all is an entirely creative process, and the only metric that determines the validity of how you choose to break your opponent down is simply how effectively your classifications result in accurate predictions and openings for counterplay. Though the examples so far have been pretty simple and straightforward, the ways you choose to classify people can be as simple or as specific, concrete or as abstract as they need to be helpful, and frequently as you progress they will become progressively more complicated. Another personal example that is fairly specific with respect to a particular character weakness is that because Ganon is so vulnerable to inward rolls, I classify people by whether they do this, and as mentioned, when they do it, i.e., I know my frames of reference. In this case, my frame of reference is when I try to connect aerials on my opponent's shield. And sure enough, Wario rolled behind me, so that's vital info I've now got on lockdown. So, this approach is not absolutely necessary. But if you're anything like me, it helps an awful lot to have a systematic and methodical way to gather relevant information, as well as to manage the bookkeeping aspect of keeping up with important changes in your opponent's behavior so that you can adapt quickly without taking the Pavlovian route of being yeeted upon until a switch in your brain just decides to click, by which time it may well be too little too late. To that, the more precisely you manage to classify your opponent, the less overall new information you have to digest, and the more opportunities you have for counterplay. That is, if all you look out for is whether people burn their double jump after getting hit by Ganon and ad-lib the rest, chances are fantastic that you'll miss a lot of opportunities to either gain an advantage or prevent a disadvantage. And at first, this seems like an awful lot of things to keep track of, and it is to some degree. But the beauty of this skill, and any other skill for that matter, is that though it might feel awkward at first to think this way, what starts out as an unnatural feeling way of thought quickly meshes into a natural and intuitive habit if you commit to deliberately practicing it. A way that helped me practice classifying my opponents and sort of conceptualize it mid-match was to think of everything I was looking for as a checklist that I ticked off as the match progressed. Anyway, once again, we've arrived at the end of yet another SmashConceptions, having said all I think I can without either repeating myself or going into a completely different subject altogether. Thanks to everyone who took the time to hear my ideas as always, and I'll restate that which I always do, that I appreciate you guys an awful lot. If SmashConceptions has helped you and you'd like to support the channel in series, you can check out my Patreon, which will be linked in the video description, or if you'd just like to hear a little more from me in non-video format, you can check out my Twitter as well, which will also be in the description. So, thank you guys, and I'll be seeing you soon with the next video, which, by the way, will probably be about patience. Hopefully you guys will look forward to it, and if not look forward to it, at least not dread it.